Welcome back to the McGill UofT Wellbeing Seminar series. We wish to acknowledge this land on which the University of Toronto operates. For thousands of years, it has been the traditional land of the Huron-Wendat, the Seneca, and the Mississaugas of the Credit. Today, this meeting place is still home to many Indigenous people from across Turtle Island, and we are grateful to have the opportunity to work on this land. So for this season of the McGill UofT Wellbeing Research Seminar, we're hosting a collection of 3-month mini-series, each exploring active topics of discussion in our discipline. In the first 2 months, 2 invited speakers each gave a seminar presenting different perspectives on an open question in well-being research. And after both sides have been presented, the 2 speakers will return in the 3rd month for a panel discussion where both perspectives will engage in a dialogue about the quality of existing evidence, their interpretation, and the path towards building consensus or greater understanding. So this mini-series has been one of the most well-known and about one of the most well-known findings in our field, the Easterlin Paradox. So in October, some of you will remember Kelsey O'Connor shared his recent work with Richard Easterlin, finding new evidence for the paradox in recent data. Last month, we had Professor Claudia Senik share her new co-authored paper on how it might be possible to raise national happiness. And today, they are joined by their colleagues, Dr. Francesco Sarracino and Dr. Alberto Prati, for a discussion on what we know about the Easterlin Paradox, where disagreements lie, if any, and what evidence we need to reach consensus on the paradox. And I'm also very pleased to introduce Anthony McCanny, a PhD student in the Department of Economics at the University of Toronto and co-organizer of today's event as the moderator of today's discussion, and who will introduce the panel and take it away.
Thank you very much, Sophia. I appreciate it. I'm really looking forward to that, and I feel very honored to get to moderate this panel. As a little sneak peek, we had a quick meeting last week, and I had the treat of having just a mini version of the panel just for me, and it was very exciting. Lots of excitement talking about the Easterlin Paradox and what does it mean to raise national life satisfaction. So I think we're going to have a good discussion. Let me introduce our panel. We are joined by 4 wonderful researchers here to discuss the Easterlin Paradox today. Let me start by introducing Kelsey. Kelsey O'Connor is a researcher in the economics of well-being at Static. He serves as an associate editor for the Journal of Happiness Studies and sits in the executive committee for the International Society for Quality of Life Studies, ISQUALS, and on the advisory panel for the What Works Center. He's a research affiliate with the IZA Institute of Labor Economics and GLO fellow with the Global Labor Organization, and his research focuses on assessing both the causes and consequences of subjective well-being and life satisfaction. He completed his PhD in economics in 2017 at USC and has worked closely with Richard Easterlin over the last several years, building the case for the Easterlin Paradox in recent data. Thank you so much, Kelsey, for joining us. Let me introduce everybody, and then I'll come back around and we'll talk about what we presented last time. I'd also like to introduce Claudia. Claudia Senik is professor at Sorbonne University and the Paris School of Economics, and she's a member of the Institut Universitaire de France. She is the director of the Wellbeing Observatory at CPREMAP, and educated at the École Normale Supérieure, and received her PhD at EHESS. Her work is on the income distribution and redistribution and subjective well-being, and she looks into democracy, market liberalization, political preferences, and we were lucky enough to have her share her recent work using memory of life satisfaction to generate a measure of potential latent life satisfaction and investigating how that changes over time. We will address that again today. We are also joined by Claudia's co-author on that paper, Alberto Prati, who's studied econometrics and philosophy and has pursued a PhD in economics at Aix-Marseille School of Economics. His doctoral thesis was well regarded on memory and well-being, received ISQUALS Dissertation Award. He's currently an assistant professor in economics at UCL and serves as an associate editor of the Journal of Happiness Studies. He's a research fellow at the University of Oxford and an associate researcher at LSE. And his research aims to solve methodological issues with subjective measures of well-being, as his work with Claudia shows. And I'm excited to hear his addition as a co-author of that paper that we had on this series last month. And finally, I would like to introduce Francesco Sarracino, a senior economist at the research department at Static. the National Institute of Statistics and Economic Studies of Luxembourg. He leads the research unit on well-being and entrepreneurship and serves as deputy director of the research division. His work focuses on identifying evidence-based policies to promote socially and environmentally sustainable development and enhance people's well-being. He holds a PhD in development economics from the University of Friends, and he has been a postdoctoral researcher at CEPS and instead in Luxembourg, and a DAAD fellow at GESIS. He is a member of the World Wellbeing Panel, of the Australian Centre on Quality of Life, and of the Esquales. His recent work thinking about the conditions under which well-being, national life satisfaction can be improved is, I think, a great addition to this panel and our discussion today. So thank you all for joining us today. I'm very excited. I wanted to just first do a quick little summary of some of the work that we've already seen, just for those who might not have been able to join us in previous months. So Claudia, can I ask you just to give us a quick sort of real brief summary of the paper that you presented last month? What is it that we should take away?
Yeah, so I'll share my screen and I'll tell you this in 2 slides. So this is the Easterlin Paradox. Life satisfaction over the long run is following a flat trend. This is United States, 1959, 2008. This is Human Development Index, and this is GDP per capita. So all our efforts to increase people's circumstances and affluence and maybe HDI, so life expectancy and education level, just useless because there is something like adaptation, hedonic treadmill. People's aspirations rise together with their attainment. Or is this because we measure everything on the bounded scale, described as representing the worst possible life, the 0, to the best possible life, the 10, which of course refers to a context, and the context is changing. So if you take, in order to measure, to take this into account, we can use the fact that sometimes people are asked about their current life satisfaction and also their past life satisfaction. So when there is a discrepancy in what people said, say last year, and what they say today about last year, maybe or 5 years ago, we can interpret this discrepancy as the fact that maybe the context has changed and the scale has changed. There is rescaling. And if we do that, we can reconstruct, we can infer the deformation of the scale. For instance, here on this graph, the scale is stretching upwards. This is the first 0 to 10. And then over time, every 5 years, we have a new data point about what people say today about how they felt 5 years ago compared to what they said at that time, the difference between the blue and the green line. Anyway, we can reconstruct the extension of the scale and the evolution of life satisfaction, which would be represented by this red curve that we call the M line, like memory. And so we show that if we interpret the discrepancy between retrospective life satisfaction and life satisfaction as it was declared at that time, then we can see life satisfaction, the reconstructed life satisfaction, hedonic life satisfaction, maybe something latent, something intrinsic that you would never see. We will never be able to see this way under some assumptions, and show that it's possible to raise national happiness. And the motivation for doing this is that we're economists, we're thinking about public policy. The objective of any action for economists is to maximize utility. For an individual, it's individual utility. For a government, it's social welfare. If there is no hope to increase durably national happiness, then it's a bit hopeless. If we believe that it's possible, then hope is there again. So, of course, both things are right. With Alberto, we really think deeply that there is something, adaptation is real. People adapt, aspirations move up, etc. This is for real. But also, rescaling is also happening. So probably the truth is between the two lines. I think I summarized the paper.
Did a great job. Wonderful. Thank you, Claudia. Alberto, can I ask you maybe a follow-up question to bring your insights into this? That last point that Claudia landed on, this sort of, as you set it up in the paper nicely, as there's kind of these two hypotheses that we can adopt, sort of this hedonic adaptation hypothesis, that in reality, this sort of observed, reported measure of life satisfaction is telling us truly about sort of this latent life satisfaction, that it keeps adapting to sort of new expectations. And on the other side of this hypothesis about rescaling, that in reality, there's this latent life satisfaction that is changing over time, but our scale keeps shifting. And so we get these measurements that look like there's no change over time. That seems like, that's the crux of the paper, and you sort of adopt like well, let's adopt the rescaling hypothesis and see what that implies about what would be happening in the world. It seems like to sort of make use of these insights, we need to tease out how close are we to this hedonic adaptation hypothesis? How close are we to this rescaling hypothesis? Do you have any thoughts about how we can test which of those worlds we're in, or how close we are on that spectrum to one or the other?
Certainly no. So this is really like the path forward. Would be great if someone comes up with a good strategy to disentangle the two. For the moment, honestly, no, I don't really have an idea, because the problem is quite deep, and the problem is that we have two latent functions. So one is the function from the objective situation to the feeling, the utility function, we would say in economics, and the other one is the reporting function, which maps the feeling into the 0 to 10 scale, and both are latent. So I don't have a brilliant idea, but I would love someone to come up with an idea to disentangle the two. And what I feel pretty confident, and Claudia already mentioned, is that the truth is likely to be in between. That is to say, we're likely to have both rescaling and adaptation. So it's more a question of quantifying how much of each one is happening rather than excluding one of the two.
I like that. So kind of thinking about this as like a lower and upper bound almost on what world we're in, this rescaling and hedonic adaptation. I like that.
Yeah.
Kelsey, can I switch over to you and ask you to give us a quick summary of the work that you shared, and maybe just this provides a nice sort of just like basis reintroduction if you've forgotten about the Easterlin Paradox. What does it mean? What are we talking about?
Yes, I think you can see my slide, correct?
Yeah, absolutely. Do you want to make it full screen?
Yes. So just as a reminder, because a lot of people get this wrong, and it's not really the main focus today, but the Easterlin Paradox is really a contradiction of results. So countries that have higher GDP per capita are on average happier. This is this cross-sectional result. But over time, countries with greater GDP per capita growth do not experience increases in happiness that correspond actually with growth. And that's the crux. So it's this contradiction between the two different findings, but it is the second finding that is controversial and what we're really talking about today. Also, Easterlin made a distinction between the long-run trends and the short-run fluctuations. So we see fluctuations, especially around recessions, where happiness declines. But what we're interested in, in Claudia's words, was what can durably improve happiness in over a longer period of time. Is part of the idea behind durability. And here's some of the evidence that we published in 2021, 2022. So across the left, you have the annual change in life satisfaction. Across the bottom, you have the GDP per capita growth rate. And what we're trying to do is see if there's a relationship between these two variables. What Claudia mentioned for the United States is where the evidence started with the Easterlin Paradox, that if you look at the United States over this longer period of time, especially since the 70s, using the General Social Survey, happiness has been flat or maybe even declining. However, it's not the case that happiness is flat in all countries. So if you look here, actually, we see an annual change in life satisfaction in the vast majority of countries is positive. And it's actually quite large in some of these countries. Over this period of time, this long run period from a maximum of 1981 to 2019. So 1981 is primarily these more Western developed countries, but then we still have quite a few countries entering in the 1990s. And typically we're getting multiple waves of data here. And that's part of what distinguishes these country groups, and part of the analysis that we try to conduct. So, and when you look within each group, and I'll define these groups momentarily, you see that actually there's been there's a decreasing slope here, or a negative slope. So that is, countries that have grown faster economically have actually experienced a decline in life satisfaction, a faster decline in life satisfaction. There's one exceptional group here where it is positive, and this is the developed countries. So these are the countries that generally, so they had higher levels of income, GDP per capita, and also generally had higher levels of life satisfaction at the time. The group that you would expect to have potentially the strongest relationship with growth are the countries that had the lowest level of growth to begin with. And those are the LDCs, the less developed countries here in orange with triangles. So it's a bit surprising. And then this group here is quite exceptional and important for understanding the paradox. And that is basically countries that had transitioned from communism to democracy, to a market-based economy in the 1990s. And they experienced really tremendous growth rates in life satisfaction, as well as growth rates in GDP per capita. But when you look at within them, the relationship is negative. So it's not that Azerbaijan, which grew the quickest, or Georgia or Armenia, which grew quite quickly, experienced greater changes in happiness compared to Moldova or Ukraine, for example, Albania. And other things are happening there. And that's part of, I think, what's interesting. And it kind of gets into what Francesco will talk about, and what I think is quite relevant for us more broadly, is what caused the increase in happiness in these countries. Because, if you look within, it wasn't growth. It was something else. And as you know, they went through substantial social change, as well as institutional change, formal institutional change during this period. So I'll leave it at that, but there's quite a bit more evidence if we have time to get back to it.
Amazing. Okay, that's great. Thank you so much, Kelsey. Can I ask you just a sort of like a methodological sort of follow-up question to that? So when I think about the Easterlin Paradox, I think about it as like, in some ways, sort of trying to disprove an assumption maybe that's being inherently made by policymakers in general, that increasing GDP per capita in the long run should lead to better lives for the people in a population or a country. And really the surprising result, as you've said, is that there doesn't appear to be this correlation between GDP per capita changes in the long run and life satisfaction growth. If that's the major takeaway we want, is sort of this lack of correlation between these two things, most of the work that I've seen, at least, has sort of null results, which are informative, right? Like, we'd expect that there would be this correlation here, but we don't see it. And it strikes me that sort of one way we could think about this is try to actually, from a methodological point of view, reject the null hypothesis that there could be a correlation between these two things. And maybe the reason that that's important is that because we're looking at these long run changes, we have relatively few data points, because we need good data sets over a long period of time in order to make these points. What are your thoughts on sort of trying to do something like, say, an equivalence test, sort of actually test this hypothesis that the correlation is sort of within a bound close to zero? And I think maybe more interestingly, how do we think about what is the cutoff, the range around zero that's small enough not to matter, right? If there's some correlation with GDP per capita and long-run life satisfaction growth, that could be good. How much is too little for us to really take notice?
Yeah, so a lot of questions there, actually.
Sorry.
Okay, so I'm just trying to take notes here. What's really important to note is that it is possible for someone to, I'd say, have a better life in some sort of objective sense, but not necessarily feel better about it, partially because their aspirations have changed over a long period of time. And so that's one reason why I like what Alberto and Claudia are doing. Now, we may disagree on a lot of details, but I still think it's important. The Easterlin Paradox is about how people feel about their lives. So important nuance. And I think that the big picture is, regardless of how you personally feel about some of the evidence, I think it's unequivocal that the point is that we shouldn't be focusing on growth to improve how people feel about their lives. Growth may be an instrument to improve lives, but it's certainly not the only one or the most important one. Okay, so those are my two most important points. But to respond to some of your specific questions, we do see from the evidence that the relationships are generally not statistically different from zero. So that's how it is set up already. So we're not testing. Yeah, we cannot discern them separately from zero, right? That's how the statistical significance is working. So I think that that's fine. But more interestingly is what's the size that's relevant. And I think then we come back to what's the alternative. So I believe when we look at the results, and I can go back to interpret the size, that the relationship, just off of my own feelings, is too small to be the most interesting. But to be more practical, let's compare it with alternative policies and see which has a larger impact. So, going forward with this well-being efficiency discussion, let's look at tools to improve well-being and see which one is most efficient.
And I think to that last point, just thinking back to the graph you shared, I mean, we see that there are changes in the long run that have happened across countries. The life satisfaction has improved nationally. Doesn't seem like growth is what was doing it. That at least points to the fact that there are other mechanisms, other policies we should be thinking about beyond GDP growth.
Absolutely.
Great. Thank you for your answers, Kelsey. Finally, Francesco, just as we go around the circle here before we broaden things out, Francesco, I wanted to ask you, I enjoyed reading a paper you published recently about sort of the conditions under which life satisfaction, or sort of GDP growth can lead to life satisfaction increases, and thinking about like heterogeneous effects across countries. I was wondering if you had any thoughts about that, about sort of what we should think about, what we know so far about sort of what are the conditions perhaps under which growth and life satisfaction are strongly related.
Yeah, great question. Thank you. I've been following the debate on the Easterlin Paradox since the beginning. It's probably the topic that took me to this discipline. And it was very passionate at the beginning. So early 2010s, we had the first article by Professor Easterlin and colleagues, and then the reply by Stevenson and Wolfers. And there was this strong debate. Is it a long-term? Is it short-term? Do they correlate? Don't they correlate? Is always flat? Is it because of adaptation? And with the passing of time, I got persuaded that they were both right, because practically we observed that in some countries, and the United States is a very good example, in some countries, economic growth is not followed by any significant changes in well-being. But we have various countries in which instead economic growth and well-being evolve together. Here I'm speaking about well-being and economic growth, but of course I mean well-being changes. So that is what led me to think that maybe the correct question is not whether economic growth and well-being are associated, but under which conditions we can have economic growth accompanying well-being. So what is that makes those countries both performing well economically and performing well from the point of view of quality of growth? And this is not something that is completely out of the blue, because now we have accumulated quite some evidence, macroeconomic evidence, that happiness contributes to productivity, for instance, which is one of the ingredients of growth. So the fact that there can be a coevolution there is not. So this led me to investigate, or to start investigating, some of the conditions that can actually improve quality of life. One of these is the role of social relations. And basically, what we found is that when in countries where social relations do not deplete over time and inequality is limited, there are higher chances that we can observe growing well-being and economic growth. if you allow me, I would also like to briefly chip in into the question you asked to Kelsey about how small should a variation be in order to consider it negligible. It's obviously a difficult question to answer, but recently I've been playing a little bit trying to reproduce my previous result using the aggregated Gallup World Poll data. So I actually downloaded the Excel sheet from the appendix of the World Happiness Report of 2024, and I just played with crude differences between initial period and the final period. And basically what turns out is that there is, according to those data, no country that has a difference in life satisfaction that is exactly zero over a period that now covers 2006, or is it approximately 18 years. Then you can start decide what is a bandwidth that you can consider as a zero, as a practically zero result. And again, difficult to start. I can show you if you want a quick chart.
Sure. That'd be great.
Let me see if I manage to share the screen. So these are the data from the World Happiness Report 2024. GDP per capita growth on the x-axis, changes in life evaluation on the y-axis. I used the same methodology of the World Happiness Report. So I took the averages of the first 3 years and the averages of the last 3 years for both measures. And then I computed the differences between the initial and the final year. And what you see here with these hollow brown dots are the differences in life evaluation that take place in periods when the economy grows, but basically I consider virtually zero. So these are actually within 0.2 variations of life evaluation. But what is interesting is that one standard deviation in the difference in life evaluation is 0.7. So this gives you a little bit an idea of how much or how little we are in the distribution that is very nicely normally distributed. So difficult to say whether life evaluation is virtually not changing in Singapore, for instance, but the first message is that no country is actually really having a zero change. And even if we take a conservative measure of 0.7, we still have a lot of various occasions when countries are above or below that threshold. So where the changes in life evaluation are likely more meaningful. And interestingly, most of these countries are located in the upper right quadrant, except countries belonging to a lower middle income. And the upper right quadrant is the one corresponding to growing economies and growing life evaluation. Then the question is, why? What is going on in these countries? Why are they, if you want, virtuous? But I give it back to you now.
Thank you. So the takeaway there being that even if we consider this like rather broad range in which we can think of sort of a zero change, sort of looking at the standard deviation, there's still many outliers, still many countries outside of that. And you're suggesting that in some cases those countries are marked by high growth. That's the suggestion, right? Okay, interesting. And one of the questions that I wanted to bring to the panel today is just sort of this most basic question of like, do we buy sort of the simplest hypothesis that there's not a large correlation between long run growth and changes in observed reported life satisfaction? That sort of maybe pointing at that, Francesco, you're saying that there's maybe some evidence pointing in the other direction. Kelsey, I'd be curious if you have a comment about maybe sort of what countries those are. I know that in your work you sort of pointed at sort of like countries that have experienced a lot of recent growth or recovered from sort of other like political situations like our Eastern European and Baltic countries, that we see this correlation, but it's not sort of maybe driven by growth. Yeah,
short answer is yeah. I think that the average relationship is rather small. So if there is a relationship in some countries, it's fairly small. I also want to say that occasionally growth could be improving well-being. In certain countries, I would imagine lower income countries where you still need improvements in basic goods and services. But then growth could be offsetting those benefits as well. So, and it's not necessarily growth. Sorry, let me restate. It's modernization. It's the change in societal characteristics. So I think that the evidence is, on average, growth does not have a positive effect on, or a meaningfully positive effect on well-being. But there can be exceptional cases. And I think that one way to look at this further is to look at offsetting characteristics. And so I don't have the best example for specific countries. I think that what caused the growth in subjective well-being and in the Eastern European transition countries was not GDP growth. I think it was a recovery from earlier stages. I hope that answers your question.
Yeah. And just to clarify, when you say sort of offsetting factors, you mean changes that co-occur with growth that may drag down how people feel about their lives?
Yes, and it doesn't have to be caused by exactly as you say, that co-occur, and they may be even offset by a few years, because we're talking about long-run changes. So it could be, but yes, co-occur in the broad sense. Yes. So an example, coming from Francesco's work is going to be the quality of the social environment, the quality of the physical environment, or the environment, actually, ecological environment, as examples.
Right. I'm curious, Claudia, Alberto.
Yeah.
Yes, Claudia. Yeah.
Yeah, I want to say two things. So first, I of course, I agree there are other things to happiness than income. So of course, at a global level, trust, social trust matters, as we know, social links, but also the social network, welfare states, the common good. Income inequality matters. We're looking at average income. GDP per capita is the average. Income distribution matters. Where you stand in the income distribution also matters. This can the income gaps can neutralize each other and create something like a close to a zero-sum game. Having prospects, the trajectory on which you see yourself is extremely important. People always think about what they expect, what they can hope for. So this is, of course, going in the sense of Kelsey. But the other thing I want to say is this question of the magnitude. If you think in the terms of in the framework that of our paper with Alberto, it's not really clear what it means, because if the scale is changing all the time, and the meaning of the distance between the two steps of the scale is changing, the question of how much you move on the scale when there is GDP growth on the scale of self-reported life satisfaction does not really, has less information that you could think, let's say. So I don't think it's, I mean, this goes back to all the work by Stevenson and Wolfers, who tries to really estimate, and ask how far are we from zero, et cetera. But if you think that rescaling is taking place, which was the intuition of the initial ladder formulation, then again, this is maybe not the right question.
Right. So there's an inherent challenge with thinking about what is the smallest threshold of change that matters when we're not sure that the scale, we can't interpret the scale consistently or maybe even across countries.
Maybe what we can do is in the cross-section, look at marginal rates of substitution. So how much income would it take to create the same impact on life satisfaction as getting married, getting divorced, getting a job, losing one's job, etc. Trying to compare in a given point of time the relative importance of different things. This is not completely correct, because this would be to do this, you would really need to assume that all these things are completely independent one from the other. We always forget that, but the variables should be orthogonal. Well, okay, so we're not purists, but at least you're comparing things that are measured in a given point of time, so there is no rescaling. Otherwise, you have this dynamic problem.
Yeah, it's a good point. Alberto, Francesco, Kelsey, feel free to jump in if you've got thoughts on this?
Yeah, maybe a couple of things, if I may. So one is I commenting on the figure that Francesco showed. It seems to be that we actually agree on the fact that there is there seems to be some correlation with ink, and the question is it just too small to make sense, which is a bit of a different question. But yeah, I think the broader question is, if we want to adopt this measure on the long term, then it becomes a very important question. Like, is there can we actually rise, considering that the scale is just bounded? And maybe it could be useful to mention something from a micro perspective, so individual level. So in the study we run with Claudia, when we take into consideration rescaling, the coefficients, most of the coefficients estimated at the individual level are the same, the same sign, but the magnitude is bigger, which essentially would mean that we might just be underestimating the effect of events on people's life, because people are adapting their scale, and therefore they're masking part of this change. And this seems to indicate that also, if we want to look at policies, if they have a positive effect or not, it's going to be very hard to identify a 0.05 change. It might be possible, but it's often within the confidence interval. So maybe we're making our job harder than it actually is by not controlling for the change in the scale.
Yeah, Kelsey, yeah.
So I've been thinking about this a lot, because actually I like Alberto and Claudia's paper, and I guess I'll try to be just really quick. Let's assume that both rescaling and adaptation are occurring, and I think that Claudia and Alberto agree with that. What I'm thinking of your M-line measure is just an adjusted measure of subjective well-being. It's an aspiration constant measure, and so the question is, so when we use subjective well-being, we're giving full weight to changes in aspirations or adaptation. We're allowing the full amount. And when we use your measure, we are kind of removing at least a large proportion of both aspirations change and adaptation through aspiration and rescaling. And I think this is part of what Anthony said before, that we get maybe a lower and an upper bound. So this is inherent. Aspiration, expectation, adaptation is inherent in subjective well-being. That's why it's very easy also to study it. We know that this is part of what's going on. It makes it a little bit more difficult when looking at the M-line, although I think it's quite valuable. So I think an important policy question for us, and this is mostly, I would say, let's call this the wonks, and we have to get around how to do this so we can communicate properly to policy decision makers, is how much do we want to ignore and or include adaptation? And so maybe the question is over what time horizon. So if you look over a person of a period's life, so let's say 30 years, a working age life, and then we can look at different people in young groups and older groups, and because they also have cognitive differences that may be important to account for. Maybe that's the right measure. We want to allow for people to adapt, because people make mistakes in orienting. They do things that don't make them happy, right? Mm-hmm. And part of that is because they don't account for, at least what we've thought of historically, as how they're going to adapt to, and there's a whole bunch of literature you guys would be more familiar perhaps in psychological literature. People make mistakes. Do we want to remove that from our analysis by focusing either on the cross-section or removing adaptation? So it's a difficult question. I like your upper and lower bound description, Anthony. Oops, I gave you a thumb. Okay, thank you.
Thumbs up to you as well. Yeah, I like that. Maybe just very briefly, just like one way of characterizing, I think what you're saying is that like maybe people's preferences change is also a part of what's happening. And so that like looking back at the past and saying that life is not as good as the life I have now is part of people's, changing what they think they want, and that's a real phenomenon that you're pointing to, which is similar to hedonic adaptation. But yeah.
100%. And as far as I understood, Claudia and Alberto completely agree with that. It's just they want to remove the rescaling aspect as well, which, or I'll let them speak. Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, I would love to hear, Claudia, about what you think about that argument about how much rescaling we want to remove or how much adaptation we want to remove.
Sorry. Yeah, we would like to correct for rescaling completely. So with Alberto, we would love if in future surveys, we would systematically include the question about past life satisfaction, and maybe not only life satisfaction, maybe satisfaction with different domains. So we could see the rhythm of rescaling, so of moving of aspirations in different domains. Maybe it's not the same. So in Easterlin's formulation, it was all about material aspirations. The question is raised about, is it only about material aspirations or is it about everything? Do you want to remove adaptation? If we went back to a world where you don't have tap water and heating, this basic good that we don't even realize anymore, we would be very unhappy. So, we have to take adaptation into account, but it doesn't mean that what we adapt to is worthless. If we go back, it's very painful. So this would be a good experiment. I mean,
yeah, I can see what you're saying. Alberto, anything else you want to add to that?
No, essentially I agree. I mean, I think it's important to answer Kelsey's question. It would be important to report both statistics, essentially. Because there are some situations which are just paradoxical. During the pandemic, all panels are flat. They go a little bit high during the pandemic, which is something weird. So this is also part of something that we analyze in the paper. Or we also show in the paper that life satisfaction in Ukraine is flat. It's the same as in 2018. These are situations which are quite paradoxical, and it could be the case. So in both situations, it could be the case that people are generally as good in lockdown than before, or generally as good during invasion war than before. It could be, but I think it's important to give this arrow to the bow of, okay, it might be a problem of rescaling, and if we have this as a statistics, at least this could be documented. So I would report them both.
If I may, so I like Alberto's response. I feel that rescaling is a smaller issue than adaptation change. And part of this, I looked at this functional form. And so the reference level is part of how people think of utility. And so Diener defines life satisfaction as relative to evaluating one's circumstances relative to an internally set reference point. And so I'm kind of the opinion there is no such thing as objective happiness, objective subjective well-being. Latent subjective well-being is extremely difficult to define. So I like this. Public policymakers still want to know whether or not life's improved. And we can use, if I remember John and Chris' description of how we might use subjective well-being in the future, we use subjective well-being to identify the factors that are important to people and the relative weights that people place on them. But if we do that from, let's say, 2019, their weights may have changed in 2020. But the policymaker still wants to target those objects, let's say. And one way to summarize the outcome of these objects is to use your M line. So there's a lot here to disentangle. But okay, I'll stop there.
No, I appreciate that. Francesco, I just wanted to check in.
Yeah, sure. Because a lot has been said, and I think we are in general in agreement that I do believe that there may be an error in the measurements that we're having. But the point is that ultimately, even if there is an error, that error is driving real-life consequences, real-life decisions in people experience. We found very evidence showing that people's well-being predicts electoral success, for instance, or happy people tend to adopt less risky behaviors. So there is a number of consequences that are predicted by subjective well-being measures that then have real-life consequences, and this is a good reason for caring about subjective well-being in public decision-making. I mean, so I think on this we're all in agreement. And then the next question is, okay, then what is that we can do to improve people's well-being? And here we're back to the point that Kelsey was making a few minutes ago. So what are the conditions that give us higher chances to lead satisfactory life in the future? And he was also making a point about the role that economic growth may have in poor countries compared to rich countries. And if you are not already bored with my slides, I would like to share another one.
Yeah, just briefly, I think we should head over to questions from the audience. Yeah.
So this is the same chart that I showed you before, except that now I am marking with circles and with diamonds countries when in the same period we observe decreasing social support and increasing social support. So the first thing you notice for high-income countries is that the relation between GDP per capita growth and changes in life evaluation is flat. Our countries, nearly all of them, are countries where social support has been declining, whereas in the other case, the arrow is clearly positive. And it is the only case in the four groups where you observe this difference in slopes. In all the others, you see that economic growth is buying happiness, if you want, in nearly every context, except in lower middle income. And the slopes are steeper for low income and upper middle income compared to those where social support is increasing. Why is it so? Well, to me, this speaks about the quality of economic growth. Perhaps this is, for instance, in this group, upper middle income countries, perhaps this is a group of countries where the economy is more compatible with the relational needs, people's relational needs, and therefore more conducive to also sustain the well-being of those people compared to others. So, and here I stop sharing. So I think the point is really that, yes, economic growth can buy quality of life, probably by taking people out of poverty in many countries, but especially when it comes to high-income countries, then it is likely something else that matters for well-being. This something else could be social relations, could be social safety nets, could be employment, low inequality. And the last point I'd like to make is once we are in agreement about the limits and the potential of subjective well-being measures, then what do we learn about how to measure well-being? So if there is a chance to improve people's well-being, how shall we measure those improvements? If there is a memory bias, for instance, which could be the case, perhaps rather than checking just the differences in absolute levels between two timing points, we may want to start thinking about other measures like either adopting a more eudaimonic approach or adopting something like trying to establish how well people manage to extract well-being from the resources they have, what we called well-being efficiency, me and Kelsey some time ago. So I think this opens the debate then for how do we measure well-being? What are the relevant measures?
Thank you. That's great. I like that. And I think that's a nice note. It summarizes some of the themes that we have here, which I can sort of broadly classify as there's sort of a general agreement that there's maybe not enough correlation between long-run growth and changes in life satisfaction at the national level to suggest that there's just sort of this unimodal, sort of this one factor model of how you improve life in a society. It seems to matter what the conditions are, what the cofactors are that might be impacting people's life satisfaction growth over time. And also at the other side, there's also a measurement question about how do we measure what really matters? Whether there's this latent life satisfaction, how do we balance between this hedonic adaptation and rescaling hypotheses that give us this sort of upper and lower bound? We could obviously keep talking this forever. There's many beautiful minds in this chat that I would like to get to and see if they have questions. So I'm going to try to turn it over now to folks' questions from the audience. Feel free to put up your hand. I'm going to quickly allow people to unmute themselves. Great. So put up your hand if you'd like to ask a question. We have time for maybe a couple. Chris, I noted that you've got some great questions in the chat. Is there one that you'd like to pose to our panelists?
Not in a short time available. It may be better just to say I feel like I need more sessions with these researchers on this topic. And with apologies to Claudia, I'm having a hard time really getting on board with their evidence. And here's one place I get stuck. So if actually 2 days ago I read through my own diary of sort of the hardest part of my life from some years ago, and thinking, look, if I had, this was actually just prior to meeting John Helliwell, and I was not recording my life satisfaction at that time. But if you asked me now, how happy was I in some period in my past, and then you said, well, actually, you wrote down your life satisfaction. I asked you that question with this phrasing, in this year, and this is what you said. I would tell you that was the correct answer. And this is because of how I interpret the life satisfaction question, right? So this was my experience now. This was how life felt to me. And so I don't think that I rescaled in that sense. I'm really stuck on the idea that, the affective and reward system interpretation of life satisfaction question is the right way to think about it. So I've got a lot of processing of all of the
we agree with that
evidence here. Sorry?
We agree with that. We think that what people say was correct. We don't think that they made a mistake at the time that they reported. That's what you say, no?
That's right, but you're making inference based on how people, what they think they would have said.
Can I chip in? I think it would help to think it this way. Let's say, Chris, I ask you how satisfied you are with your life, and I'm sure you're very satisfied. You would tell me 9, and then I ask you, are you more satisfied than last year? And you tell me no. And then I check, and last year you said 8. I would say, oh no, you're wrong. You're actually more satisfied. You would probably say, no, Alberto. I'm more satisfied today.
No, of course not. No, because the expert was the person experiencing the life at the time that they responded. And memory is a terrible thing. And we have all kinds of projection biases. And to ask me to project remembered circumstances on, project my affective response or subjective response based on my remembered objective circumstances. I mean, this fits into all kinds of classic psychological biases. Anyway, let's listen to somebody else.
I just want to say what we think with Alberto is that what you report at a given point of time is correct, given the scale is what it is. And if you say that you are more happier or less happy, this is also correct. What is not correct is the number that you report for the past. But the way Alberto formulated, do you feel happier or less happy than 5 years ago or last year? We grant, we take this as containing some truth.
Right, and I'm very skeptical of that.
Okay.
Yeah.
John, maybe you want to ask the last question here.
Tough place to be. Really interesting discussion. To me, the underlying bigger question is what does determine subjective well-being? And what comes out of this literature very loudly is it ain't income. Income's in part of it, but it's very much the lesser part. So we have to broaden whether it's adaptation or anything else, we have to think about it in different aspects of life. What are the things that are important, and are they enduringly important or not? And so I spent a lot more of my time looking at situations, most recently in Afghanistan, what happened during the past 15 years. And these are monstrous changes in life evaluations, and they had only the tiniest link to the levels of income. And that's probably true in those countries where you have a positive correlation between income and increases in happiness. It's because other things that were more important were happening at the same time. And it's negative across some countries because the income itself may have had negative externalities. These are not statistically independent variables. So the next stage is to come back and say, well, what is important? And it isn't that income has no importance. It certainly does, but it is only part of a broader network that we need to study more deeply. But thank you for these fascinating presentations.
And thank you for your comment. Do any of our panelists have a final comment on John's word there?
I think I'm completely in agreement with John's last word. I mean, there is much more to happiness than income and economic growth, and that's what on what we should focus our policy efforts.
If I may, I agree with what Francesco said, and also John. I think I could speak for just a couple of words for Easterlin. He did feel that happiness could be increased. He focused on welfare state and full employment, but his emphasis was, what he wanted to do was address that question. What can we do to improve happiness at a societal level? And he didn't care about growth per se. It was just whatever, we find that improves happiness, and that's what we should be focusing on.
Thank you very much, Kelsey. That, I think, is a lovely place to end our discussion today, with that question of how can we raise happiness. That's our jobs, I guess. Thank you all for joining us. Thank you very much to our panelists. Thank you, Claudia, Alberto, Kelsey, Francesco. Really appreciate your time and sharing your work with us here today. And thank you, everybody who's attended over the last 3 months for this little experiment in how to run a seminar series. I've had a lot of fun, so thank you for making it so good. We are going to be back next year. We're going to do this again with a different topic. Based on the conversation today, I was like, well, I wish we didn't have anything planned. We could just have this discussion over and over again every month. But I assume you all have other things you need to do. But next semester, I'm in school. Next semester, we will be thinking about the impact of social media on youth mental health and well-being, and having that conversation, which is also hot in the literature. Sophia, remind me when our first session is in January. I'm blanking on the date.
January 14th.
January 14th. We will be back at the same time with our first presenter. And I'm also blanking, Sophia, who's presenting first?
It'll be Dr. David Blanchflower on January 14th, and we will send out an email about 1 week prior with all of the information and Zoom link. And we also encourage, to share the seminar with your colleagues who are interested in well-being research. We love to see everybody come back. And I just want to reiterate that we really appreciate you all for sticking around for a couple of extra minutes at the end. Thank you to all the panelists. And I believe we have one more announcement from Chris, I believe.
All right. The brief version is just to remind people that this seminar series is supported by the Canadian Happiness Economics Research Network, Cheung. And there's a separate mailing list from that, but I will probably cross-post about an upcoming general meeting that we should have for that organization. Thanks.
Thank you, Chris. And thank you, everybody. Have a lovely holiday season. We'll see you next year.
Bye.
Thank you.
Bye.